So I started composing, and I knew that this was something that I could really do like every waking hour. So like 45 years later, that hasn't changed. I could still do that every waking hour.
Hello, welcome to the Flute 360 podcast, where we incorporate a panoramic view of flute-related topics. I am your host, Heidi K. Begay, and this is episode 35, an interview with Daniel Dorff. Today's episode is sponsored by J&K Productions. They produce all of my episodes, from adding the intro and outro music to editing the audio and all post-production needs. Contact them for your next podcast project at jkproductions.media. Hi, Daniel.
Hi, how are you, Heidi?
Good, thank you so much. How are you doing this Saturday afternoon?
I'm doing great, and I've been looking forward to our chat.
Same here. I appreciate your time, and I know how busy you are, so I appreciate you taking the time out of your schedule to help us.
Well, been enjoying hearing what I've heard so far of Flute 360 and seeing what else you have scheduled. So I'm very honored to be in the middle of it.
Perfect. So we will dive into questions now, if that is good for you.
Mm-hmm.
Okay. So for those who may not know you, could you please share with us your background and tell us who you are?
Yeah, sure. So I was born in Long Island, and like a lot of kids, I started playing recorder when I was in second grade, and then in fourth grade, the teachers said, okay, now for the real instruments. And for reasons I don't really remember, I started playing saxophone as my main instrument.
Oh.
And both recorder and saxophone, I don't come from a musical family, and it was just, a lot of kids do this, but it was this weird feeling like I already knew how to do it. Like I knew how to read music the first time I saw it. And I just had this voracious appetite to get sheet music books and read through them. And like, I didn't understand what I was doing, but I was moving my fingers and looking at the dots. And it was just so exciting that I really fell in love with just doing all of that. And then eventually, year by year, I taught myself what I thought was music theory, even though it wasn't really, but I taught myself what chord symbols mean from using a Beatles songbook.
Okay.
And started to learn about music more structurally from Beatles and Rolling Stones fake books and all that. And then by the time I got in high school, the music teachers at school saw what was going on. Like, I was teaching myself a lot of stuff, not the way they wanted me to, but, with this real appetite to learn. So they steered me towards 5 chords and the kind of things you learn in theory class and ear training, and gradually got me exposed to classical music, never trying to force it, but like it was always there until the day that I heard the last movement of Brahms first, and I flipped. I probably had heard it before, but I was ready just to say, wow. Somebody just opened up another different door. So meanwhile, I was playing saxophone, and especially if you go back like 45 years or so, there wasn't a whole lot of repertoire for saxophone. So I started to play clarinet just so I could be in orchestra and be doing other things like that. So I really hadn't thought about much of my future, and I played in a rock band in high school. So I had to start learning to play flute a little bit so we could do Locomotive Breath.
Okay.
And I was not a good flutist, but to do things like Locomotive Breath, I didn't need a good sound. I just knew how to do the fingers from saxophone. So actually on my website, there's a picture of me in high school playing Locomotive Breath.
Oh my gosh.
With hair all the way down and messy beard and one leg up like Ian Anderson.
Oh, wow.
But that's the way we were when we were 16 or 17, right?
Okay.
So the summer after 10th grade, I was really starting to get serious, and I had recently discovered classical music and started to wonder, okay, what am I going to be when I grow up? Because it was 10th grade and I didn't really know. I thought maybe I would be a mathematician or something. And I didn't feel like, I knew that there was nothing to do with saxophone if I went to classical music. And I didn't love playing clarinet, although I was just starting. So I had this idea to go to summer music camp to see what it would be like surrounded by the few kids who I know who played their violin 6 hours a day and were in every youth orchestra and so on. And to see if I could become like that, or if I knew that I couldn't, just to try to figure out, okay, I got to go to college in a few years. What am I going to do? And my parents were really supportive of this idea of trying to find out before it's too late, which is something that I guess we all learn as we get older or as we have kids. I've had my experience to talk to a lot of teenagers who are trying to figure out what to do for college. And whether it's music or other special interests, go to an intensive summer program and you'll see if you love it or if you don't feel like you fit in that seriously. So I went to Red Fox Music Camp, which it's not around anymore. It was a really nice, smallish camp right near Tanglewood, hitchhiking distance from Tanglewood. But it had a lot of good faculty and a lot of good people. I see a lot of professional musicians who went there, when I was there. So that was a really quantum event for me to go there, because now I'm suddenly surrounded by all the kids who do nothing but practice their instruments all day and know everything that Beethoven wrote, etc. And I found out pretty fast, or confirmed, that I don't have the patience or the passion to practice an instrument many hours a day. I sort of did, but not at the level of the kids who were headed to conservatories who really were there. And I knew that was telling me that I wasn't going to cut it in the world of being a performer.
Okay.
And I still didn't know what I was going to do, except a few weeks into the summer, the orchestra started rehearsing the orchestra part for the Paul Creston Fantasy for Trombone. And I only knew music up to Tchaikovsky. I thought, maybe Debussy. But Paul Creston was like totally jazzy, totally American, sort of Ravelish and Gershwinish, but also very solidly composed, like the new classical music I was getting so excited about. And I was just awestruck. I mean, I just sort of froze in place, listening and staring at the orchestra. And I thought, wow. And, my heart was pounding. I thought, this is what I want to do.
Wow.
If this piece can make me feel so entranced and excited, that's telling me something. So I thought, okay, well, I'm going to start writing my own music for saxophone, because I know what I want, and it isn't there, like to play on saxophone.
Okay.
And I mean, there was some great music, because there's the Ibert concerto and lots of chamber recital music by the other French conservatoire composers.
Sure.
But there wasn't a repertoire like every other instrument had. So I thought, okay, I know what I want to play, sort of. I'll write it. I'll write it myself. And I didn't realize sort of how naive or idealistic that was. I just started doing it.
Wow.
So I started composing, and I knew that this was something that I could really do like every waking hour. So like 45 years later, that hasn't changed. I could still do that every waking hour. And so that was sort of what got me into doing that kind of thing. So I went to Bennington College for my first year because they had 4 composers who were all fascinating to me. There was a CRI record called Bennington Faculty. And what little school, it was a liberal arts school, 500 people, maybe 15 or 20 music majors, but they had 4 great composers on the faculty.
Wow.
However, they weren't into teaching, and they weren't into the building the foundation. Bennington was, and maybe still is, a very exploratory, not traditional kind of school. And I felt that isn't what I needed at this point. So I transferred to Cornell University, where it was exactly the opposite. Not a whole lot of live music, but there was great composition and theory. And that's where I really learned about music history and every other kind of music and how to think and so on. And then I did graduate school at University of Pennsylvania because they had George Crumb. And I especially wanted to study with George Rochberg because he had gone through his transition to more sort of neo-traditional music. And I thought, here's somebody who can teach me, because the kind of music I write now is pretty much what I was writing in the 70s, where it was tonal and neo-traditional. And
right.
In academia, no teachers, no classmates took that seriously at all. They sort of treated me in a very condescending, amateurish kind of way, even though Copland was alive and Barbara was alive and, all these great composers in that vein. but they weren't teaching and they weren't respected by the people who were in the school. So it was a bizarre time that fortunately just sort of transitioned so that these days everything is a little bit more open.
Sure. What a rich background and what a great opportunity to be able to say, oh, I want to go to that specific school to study for that composer. I mean, that's what we as performers do. You know, we want to study and get those pedagogical insights from a specific performer. Yeah. So that's amazing that you were able to do that with George Crumb.
Yeah. Well, and there's more to it than that.
Okay.
Every step of the way, I faced that gulf or challenge that a lot of people do. Like, do I want to go to a conservatory and be completely around all these great musicians and those teachers?
Right.
And make friends with performers for life and so on. But then I have to give up learning about everything other than music.
Right. Yep.
And I kept on going with the mix thing, and I would apply to everything, and I kept getting into Juilliard and saying no. Because, you know, I either choose between Persichetti, if I got him, who at that time would have been the perfect teacher for me.
Right.
David Diamond might have been, but I had never heard of him yet. In retrospect, I realized he you know, was in the same kind of realm. But boy, studying with Crumb and Rochberg, it was just wonderful.
Wow. That's amazing.
Yeah.
So I'm sure each piece is unique, but generally when you compose a new work, what is your process like?
Yeah, well, you're definitely extremely right that every piece is unique in how it happens, but I would say usually it's that unique in how it gets started.
Okay.
And then to a certain extent, the work process tends to get similar. I work a lot at the piano. Okay. And I'll tell you later about my cool piano if there's time.
Oh, yeah.
And okay, so when a new piece is in the real hatching and daydreaming kind of stage, I'll sketch piano as much as I can, but, you know, wherever I am, any scrap of paper, if I get an idea in my head, or I carry, well, like everybody, I have my phone with me all the time, but I have a dictaphone app in there. Okay. Which is great because, like, if I'm in the car or I'm shopping or something and I suddenly get an idea, even if it's what groceries I need, but also if I repeat this thing in A flat, then this section will be better, or I can sing a new tune and not have to try to remember. So that's a real great way to do things. And in the course of many years of writing, I learned from experience, I guess, what is a metaphorical kind of approach of describing how to do pretty much anything creative or inventive. And I have to emphasize it's a metaphor. Right. There's a saying, write drunk, edit sober. And what that means is first you get all the ideas out without being inhibited or self-monitoring. Just, you know, let it all flow. Okay. And, you know, like just tell your right brain, go, 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 go. Okay. And it sort of siphons out all these ideas. And then later, come back and see what's worth keeping or what's worth developing and then getting to work. And there's some famous quote like, all great ideas or music, whatever, is 10% inspiration and 90% perspiration. Sure. So again, there's a metaphor, but yeah. And it's pretty similar. So I've learned that, you know, don't get bar one perfect if you're getting started. Right. Go all the way through and then come back to bar one, or else you'll just get totally stuck, right, or uninspired. But if you keep on going forward, you know, to me, I make a lot of comparisons to how other people do creativity, like painters or story writers. And, you know, imagine if you're writing a book. Right. When you write a book, well, I've never written a book, but if I were it, I would imagine you have to sort of build a storyline overall. Sure. And then start fleshing out section by section or interrelation between sections. But imagine starting on page 1 of chapter 1 and just, you know, perfecting everything before you even know what's going to happen later. Right. So, you know, composing is a little bit more abstract and ideas come in funny ways. So anyway, so I work with paper and pencil mainly, and usually at the piano, sometimes with my clarinet. if it's a woodwind piece.
Mm-hmm.
And then at some point I start making a MIDI demo as a sort of in progress way to hear how the pacing of a piece is going once I reach a point where I need to start giving myself feedback
Mm-hmm.
and to get the craft rather than the wild spark. And that helps me, it used to be that I felt there was a real stigma, like how could a real composer use MIDI?
Mm-hmm.
But because we weren't used to it, that's not how anybody of my age grew up. But wow, what a great tool, and especially to have the sense of balance for when to use it and when to not, for what's best for me. I mean, everybody has their own way of working, but I like being creative away from technology because then I just think about the musical flow, but then use the technology for that edit sober kind of stuff, because then I can play it back and think, I need a few more bars of this theme, or that chord change comes too soon or too late. And I can do that more easily if I'm just listening from the outside. It's sort of like the way painters can stand next to the canvas or have to stand next to the canvas when they're working. And if they're working on something gigantic,
Mm-hmm.
they can't see it all. Or even anything large, they can't see it the way the whole is.
Right.
But then they can walk to the back of the room and then see the whole, and, they can think micro and macro.
Right.
Back and forth while they're working. And that's harder for playwrights and musicians because of time. So to me, a MIDI playback of what I'm composing sort of in a more natural kind of way is a good way to get the best of both worlds.
Okay. There's two things I took from that answer. One,
okay.
Well, I took a lot of things out of that answer, but two things I'd like to share. One is I really appreciate how you're connecting it to other arts and literature, and you're talking about a painter or sculptor and all that, and how they're viewing and approaching their own mediums. Because I think the more, and I attribute this to a lot of my last few years obtaining my DMA at Texas Tech with Dr. Lisa Garner Santa. She opened like a whole new world for me artistically. Like, I'm so left brain and I'm so analytical and I like numbers, and if everything, I don't know, I just like lists, and she is the opposite, complete opposite. And so like working with her was amazing because she like awakened this different side to life, not just music, but to life in general. And so when I was making these connections and trying to see her world, actually art and drawing, that's something I really liked to do in high school and college. And I used to be a ballerina, and I lost that childhood sense of play as I got older. And so she kind of put a spark under that life, that past life of mine again. And so like you talking about the arts and literature and art authors and seeing how they connect to their mediums and stuff, I really appreciate that, because I think sometimes, and I'm just speaking for myself, but maybe some other musicians out there can relate to this, but it's so easy just to get locked into a practice room, especially for performers, like get locked into a practice room and just think notes on the page, and I have to rhythmically get it right or play the notes right, or, think about the technique. But to see the music and applying it to life and pulling out parallels of life through colors like art or through a storyline like literature, I think that's really important, to experience life in many facets. So that way we're not just stuck in our own little bubble.
Right. So I think in performing of any kind, you need both.
Yeah.
And, really anything. It's interesting. My sister is an architect, and the comparisons, there's this saying that I forget if it was from Thelonious Monk, or I've heard it attributed a lot of ways, that architecture is frozen music. I think that's how they say it. Because I think that's a good thing, because it's got to have structure,
right?
And it's also got to have a certain artistry,
right? Yeah.
And when I listen to music of any period, and I'm so entrenched in contemporary music, not because I'm a composer, because to me being a composer is like timeless in every time, but because I work full time at Presser, and so I'm surrounded by the composers whose music I publish. So there's always brand new music that I've never heard before, and I'm always getting exposed to brand new music that I've never heard before, and digesting it and seeing how different people may be more left-brained all the time, more right-brained all the time in their personality as much as their music. And some people are both very much. So it's interesting. So in my job at Presser, sometimes I have to be a proofreader and deal with business things, very left-brained. Sometimes I have to be completely artistic and cover designer and using both parts of the brain, which for me is just like my own composing.
Right.
Because I've got to write a piece that's interesting, because if it's too much just engineering, then it will be neat, but to me that makes it a little two-dimensional.
Right. It's not fun. It doesn't come to life.
Yeah. And if it's too crazy, then it will only be a bunch of ideas that don't really hang together over time like one coherent piece.
Right.
Now, probably everybody thinks that way, but they have a different balance, which they think is the ideal balance. But that's what makes us all different.
Yeah.
So that's really cool.
Yeah. What great.
And same thing with engraving. Most people compose with the same software that they engrave with.
Okay.
Like Finale and Sibelius. I mean, it's evolved that way. And I'm like totally the opposite. That I do all the creative work with pencil and paper and listening to playback in a different way, just because that's the creating it part. And then for making the sheet music, I use an older program called Score, which was the first mainstream engraving software. And it's still the best there is by far for just notation itself. But it doesn't do anything else. It doesn't even run Windows or Mac. It runs on DOS.
Oh, wow.
It was created in Fortran and upgraded to DOS, and there have been no upgrades in 30 years. But, that can be sort of frustrating in a superficial way, but I can always do what I want to do, and the music's always easier to read. And I don't think about technology when I'm being creative, which that's something that I like. And it probably sounds like it.
Yeah.
That it's more, and let me be clear. I love Stravinsky, and I love a lot of composers whose music is a little bit more objective and mechanistic, but that's not my own creative language.
Yeah, that's not your voice.
Yeah, and people sometimes misunderstand what living composers' likes and dislikes are.
Okay.
I love Beethoven.
Yeah.
But I don't write like Beethoven, and I love Schoenberg, and, I don't write like Schoenberg.
Right.
So what I love listening to is much broader than, what I write is not related to what I love listening to. It's what my own voice or aesthetics for what I want to write are.
Well, and I wouldn't think, I'm not a composer, but as a performer, I wouldn't want to play a Daniel Dorff who was mimicking Beethoven. I would want, that just seems silly to me.
But, when you're in school, should I mimic Rochberg you can't do that because he was all over. But, when you study with George Crumb, there was a lot of people who wanted to write just like George. And, on one hand, that's sort of natural, but I always thought, well, wait, this is my life and I only get one chance. And I'm writing to express myself.
Right.
Not to show that I can be a second-rate somebody else, because that's good for homework, but that isn't why I chose to go into a ridiculous kind of career like writing music.
Yeah.
It's because I love making my own stuff up.
And I guess as a parallel, my world is education and performing, and so what I'm hearing is to the educators and performers out there who are listening to this show, I guess the parallel I would make is, say out of the 20 students I have in my studio, I would not want them to be 20 mini Heidis. How boring. I have one student, Haley, who is just this theatrical, musical, creative light. And then I have another student, Jack, who's more methodical and analytical, and he has his own unique voice too. And so I wouldn't want to try to make either one the other person or a replica of me, because that's the beauty of life, is to have that unique voice and that unique, like you said, expressing your story. So no, that's excellent. So Daniel, would you like to share with us about your piano?
Yeah, so the piano that I've been writing on since 2001, which means everything I've written in the last 17 years, including, so that's a lot of the better known flute pieces. It's a little bit on the magic side, if you have like to play make-believe or metaphysics, it's a Steinway O from 1912 that was owned by the Theodore Presser Company. Back then, they bought it from Steinway. And back then, Presser was the biggest music publisher in the United States.
Huh.
And, it was a much different world. And that meant they were among the biggest any kind of publishers in the United States. They had their offices and a regular retail store right by the Philadelphia Orchestra in Center City, Philadelphia. So when, for instance, Rachmaninoff visited town, because he did a lot with the orchestra, he would stop by the Presser office and play their house piano. And Ravel did that, and lots of the famous conductors, and Stokowski was there. And I knew this secondhand, let's say, from somebody who I knew who had worked there, long enough back so that the oral tradition and photographs were there of this piano. So then in the 1950s, that's when Presser moved to Bryn Mawr, and it became George Rochberg's office piano. And then a few generations later, it was Vincent Persichetti office piano, like in the 1970s and 80s. Persichetti, he lived in Philadelphia. He taught at Juilliard, but he would go to Presser every Monday to look at submissions and be part of a committee that decides what Presser would publish. So that was his office piano, and he would always play things on it. And when there was extra time, he would compose on it or improvise like crazy. And there's even, you're going to think I'm joking, but in the archives, which I think they're now in the Library of Congress with the deep archives of Presser, there's a cassette tape of Persichetti playing the theme from Pac-Man on this piano.
Whoa.
So, yeah, it's sort of incongruous, but it's really cool.
Wow.
So I don't know if Vincent really knew what Pac-Man was, but he was still playing it. And Lowell Liebermann, when he was in the office, he played some of his piano music on it and so on. So then in 2001, Presser, the building was being sold, and they had to move to a smaller office in King of Prussia, where we are now. So they had to downsize, and they had to sell the piano. So I had always wanted a baby grand so I could have a middle pedal, because I had been using it like an upright up until that point. And so now the piano that I wrote Sonata Three Lakes and Flash and, everything from 2001 on is the old Presser piano that had been Persichetti's, and Rachmaninoff and Ravel's fingerprints are on it and so on. So, I can't document it other than word of mouth, and it's not worth anything, but I love just knowing that my fingers are on that kind of piano.
Oh, wow. That is so interesting. I so appreciate that story because, well, it's rich and it's, know, and I'm sure you kind of almost feel, I don't know, like when you said, oh, their fingers were also touching those same, ivory keys. It almost feels like they're in a way there with you in spirit. And yeah,
absolutely.
That's very cool. Yeah, I am totally on board with this whole, like you said, magical piano and having that sense of wonderment and thinking, oh, wow. I mean, that just makes it's not just the piano, but there's history to that.
Yeah, and also it's sort of like the left brain and right brain thing, or the metaphor of riding drunk. If I'm going to sit down at the piano and take myself out of being in suburban Philadelphia in 2018 and into the make-believe world of the piece I'm going to be writing next and not think about anything other than this make-believe world, that's sort of a good way to drift into daydreamy make-believe.
Yeah.
Is to know that.
Yeah, definitely.
Or to imagine that. It has not helped my piano playing any.
Darn, right?
Yeah.
If only I could find a flute to do the same thing. Oh, shoot. Yeah. So, moving on, since this is a flute podcast, what are your goals or intentions when writing for the instrument?
Well, that also varies piece to piece to some extent.
Sure.
And in some ways, it's an easy question. In some ways, it's hard for me to answer because I'm so close to myself.
Sure.
Like I take for granted certain things about what I think about, but I can probably say something that makes sense. So we were talking earlier about my original spark to start composing as a saxophonist of that repertoire. Like at one point, I thought, I'm going to be the Vivaldi of the saxophone.
Cool.
But that's when I was 16 and had been writing for 2 or 3 weeks. Right?
Okay.
But I did mean it. And I was very much, learning my whole sense of classical music was from the repertoire that I played on saxophone and nothing else. So I was in the middle of trying to memorize the Ibert concertino. Well, that goes a long way for getting that approach to how to write for instruments into my blood and into my breath. And I listened so much to popular music, and it was the best ever time because when I was learning about music is when the Beatles were putting out their records, and it was, on the brink of Motown was at its highest, and Stevie Wonder was at its highest, and so was Carole King. It was just such great popular music and such excitement and such a pioneering spirit of all of that. And then there's Led Zeppelin and Yes and Jethro Tull when I'm getting more. So like all of that was totally in my head, but also learning about the standard European repertoire. But also when it comes to what people want to play, to me, it was Ibert and Francais and Dubois and that kind of music. Very vivacious and luscious on the surface, but structured at the bottom. So all these years later, that's my language. That's, I think that there's, a piece has to expand beyond that narrow way of describing it. But the basic aesthetic there, I'm not talking about somebody's going to write a dissertation about the new worlds that I've discovered, the way some composers that they care very much about being different or novel or stretching the boundaries. I want to stretch the repertoire. I want to write music that people want to play. And, maybe there's some irony that in doing so, that actually does stretch the repertoire in ways that I'm not thinking of. But when I write for any instrument or any ensemble, I think about what is special, what's the special potential of that instrument's texture and potential. So when I write for piccolo, it's definitely different from writing for flute and octave because the personality is different. Although ironically, people tell me they like my piccolo music because I write for it like the way you would write for flute, like something which is beautiful and supple rather than a novelty instrument. But so there are these similarities and differences. The main thing is that I'm not writing for listeners to love it from the audience as much as you might think from the kind of music that I write.
Okay.
But I absolutely am writing for the quote audience of possible future performers of that piece. So if I write an oboe piece, I'm, the oboists of the audience who I want to please. Because if they don't want to play it, that piece is dead.
Okay. True. I mean, yeah.
Yeah. And so, and then mixed in that, for more of the aesthetic is, I just love the sound of music so much. Sorry, that sounds very trite.
No, it doesn't.
But it's, it's like taking a warm bath and smelling the perfume. And it's just so sensual, the sound of music, that it's beauty, it's escapism, it's make-believe happy places. And it seems like those kinds of aesthetics is always how I judge what I'm working on, is if it makes me feel a certain way or a certain satisfaction.
Yeah. So
taking that one step further, because it's got to be built. It can't just be pretty, because pretty doesn't last.
Right.
Or, that makes it boring after a while. So mostly I write instrumental music. I'm more drawn to instrumental music, and that's just patterns and relationships of sounds, like sort of audio algebra. And to me, the real art and the magic of making up music is to tell what's sort of like an abstract storyline with a drama, but no words and no real meaning the way that a story would have. And if you think about the great flute literature, like the Poulenc sonata or the Prokofiev sonata, that those don't tell you anything. They're not about something, but you get the same feeling that if you've just seen a movie or some kind of drama, because of you get lost in it. It goes through these emotions and so on. And even shorter pieces like Syrinx or the Bach Partita, that's so abstract,
right,
and pure. So, when it comes down to it, and this might even go back to that very first thing when I heard the Paul Creston orchestra piece, it's like miraculous that we can have these deep experiences and get lost in these entrancing things from just a little bit of a journey through abstract audio, but it grabs our emotions and our imagination so much. Sometimes people will tell me about a piece that absolutely had a title like, Partita or sonata that would nothing but that. And I once collected parts back from a band piece. It was a solo piece for xylophone and orchestra. And the parts I got back, and somebody in the trombone section had written an entire story, like, and here the Martians come and they tie everybody up, and here that, they're blasting off and they send extra people.
Wow.
And he was just like doing the opposite of film score. Like, he had the score, he was creating a film that would fit into that.
Wow.
And sometimes, not often, I'll see like people making YouTubes of their playing a piece of mine, and they make a slideshow.
Huh.
And even though that's not so story specific, I love that idea that other people are building an extra layer.
Mm-hmm.
I would love someone to make a ballet, for instance, of some of these pieces.
Oh, wow. Yeah.
And just see what they think, because then the ideas are building on the ideas.
And they're relating to it in some capacity. I mean, the trombonist who's putting a story together of Martians, I mean, like, he's probably thinking, oh, wow, this music would help portray that story that's in my head. And that's how he was able to relate to it, or what he wanted to bring out of it.
Yeah. Well, what got me the most is he wasn't just sitting there playing notes, that I reached him, or the music reached him, I should say, at some level that meant something.
Right.
That he was having some experience of a special nature one way or another.
Right. How neat. Yeah. If you ever get somebody to choreograph a ballet for you, let me know, and I'd love to dance in it. I'm the old ballerina in me, like I'm trying to find dancing opportunities because I miss it so much.
Well, I've got two pieces, neither of which are for flute, but that would be perfect. And one of them actually has a bunch of good flute parts in it, in a beautiful alto solo. But, there's this painting by Klimt called The Kiss.
Okay.
This is the one that probably a lot of people have seen it. It's these young lovers who are hugging each other or kissing, but they're actually not, even though the painting's called The Kiss. And they're wearing sort of psychedelic clothing, the way that Klimt is full of these little things of bright color. And they're inside a gold bubble, the way that new love can sometimes feel like you're inside a gold bubble, and the stars are twinkling. And so I made an orchestra piece based on that painting.
Okay.
And since the painting is fixed and it was about, a piece lasts in time, I just sort of went from the bottom of the painting up to the top, and that had a storyline in it. And I thought, this piece is so rhythmic and so dance-oriented that you could make a ballet, which isn't the way I wrote it, but it's 14 minutes of some story where the culmination is a freeze on stage where they've created the painting. Like the last second, the fermata on the double bar is the painting. So it's like how they got there.
Oh, wow.
How they got there to the point with it. And that hasn't happened yet, but 15-minute ballet, you got to have a professional ballet company interested in doing that.
Right. Yeah, that would be very interesting to get a choreographer on that project.
Yeah.
Cool. So this is a broad question, and I realize that there's a lot of different answers and avenues you could take with it. But as a composer, what statement would you like to make to performers while they are performing your works on stage? Like, what nuances or sound or like statement do you want us as performers to make of your works? Like, what do you want your work to say? And again, like I know like Three Lake Sonata, for example, or The Kiss, they're totally different pieces, but I'm trying to, since the broader audience of Flute 360 are performers or teachers, I'm trying to relate to you as a composer and portraying your works that you've worked so hard on and making sure your voice is heard and what you want to say. And that's, of course, as me as a performer on stage, like I'm also mixing in my own experiences and my own tone and my own sound, but we're also trying to, at the same time, honor what the composer wrote. So, yeah, I don't know if that's an easy question.
I have so many answers to that. And one of them, well, the first one has got to be, it depends on what piece.
Right.
But a lot of it comes down to, I want to be writing vehicles that performers want to perform for whatever reasons they want to be heard or want to love performing. And I think that the pieces of mine that get performed the most are the ones that I've been a performer, even though not at a fully professional level. I know that you pick music based on what you like playing.
Right.
Whether it means you like rehearsing it or woodshedding or being on stage with people hearing you play it, that there's something that on one hand that is very satisfying inwardly. And in some cases it may be, face it, we're performers. It may be a piece that's a good vehicle for you to show off your skill or your expressivity and your fingers or whatever. So one thing, however, that I think does need to be said is that when composers of, let's say, neo-romantic or expressive music as opposed to more precisely mechanical music, composers who write the way that I do, write espressivo, we mean it. And sometimes even if we don't write espressivo, we still mean it. And what I mean by that is, if you play music by a dead composer, or if somebody plays the same piece of mine and I'm not going to be there and I'll never hear it, in many cases they'll take liberties with the tempo, changing dynamics or whatever, doing all kinds of nuances to make it their own. The way that they would not hesitate to do with syrinx, let's say.
Okay.
And that brings it to life. That makes it three-dimensional. And, the worst thing you can say about a piece is it sounds like, or about a performance is it sounds like a MIDI performance, like that it's too robotic, right?
Yeah.
So, and this is the opposite. So I always want that. I don't personally always agree with every interpretation that everybody has, but vive la différence. I'm writing it so that people can do this because that's what it's all about. Right. And I'm always fascinated to hear different interpretations of where people add a retard or, change. Well, dynamics don't change, I think, as much as tempos, or where somebody makes something more staccato or whatever. I love that. And imagine if that didn't happen. Imagine if you go to a jazz club and every singer always sang the same song the same way. Like Boring City. What makes it a good song, the reason why there's so many people who sing Summertime or My Favorite Things, is that it lends itself to being yourself in so many different ways. So, a piece like Sonata Three Lakes can't travel that far afield, but in the first two movements, there's so much room for rubato and individualism. The third movement is more precise and mechanistic and ostinato. I don't think you can, vary and be more personalized as much in the third movement as the first two. But, some people, and I found this with people who play certain kind of like percussion in an orchestra or in a military band, anything in a military band, and that's all they do, that it takes practice or sort of reprogramming a flow of thought to then go out and play not in that ensemble. Because if you're in an ensemble that has to be precise,
right,
depends on the instrument you're on. But you're trained to not be that individualistic because you have to be precise in an ensemble of people doubling your instrument.
Right. That kind of reminds me, and I don't want to misquote her, but people can check out the interview for themselves to back up what I'm about to say. But Christina Jennings, I remember her doing an interview with Viviana Guzman, and I remember Viviana asking her, why did you not stick with the orchestral world? And she said, I had too many ideas. And so that really hit a chord with me because I thought, oh, wow, like she truly just wanted to be an artist and have her voice and say what she wanted to say through the music. And she didn't feel like, for whatever reason, being in the orchestral setting wasn't lending itself to her artistry, maybe, where she wanted to be more in the scene of a soloist or, chamber.
Yeah. So it's a really small world because only a few weeks ago, I had a phone call with her, and we were talking about George Rochberg.
Okay.
And because she transcribed one of his big violin solo pieces for flute. And she told me what I guess I had known a long time ago, that her father was one of the violinists in the Concord Quartet that George wrote a lot of commission works for. And she grew up around the Concord String Quartet, which meant that her early exposure to music was not a father who was in a major orchestra. It was a father who was in a string quartet who played a lot of new music.
Oh, wow.
So she was living that,
and
around that.
Yeah, that's perfect.
Completely explains what you were just saying that she said. So, as a composer, I used to go into rehearsals and say, pretend that I'm dead and play it that way, but no one no one was comfortable hearing that,
No.
understanding the point, which was like, pretend I'm not judgmental at all. I can say that, but people are still thinking, like, until we get into rehearsal, okay, I'm going to be Beethoven and I'm going to be sneering at everybody and saying how bad they're playing it. And, all I want to do is make sure that they can bring out their best, so I may spot some wrong pitches.
Yeah.
But a rehearsal to me is getting everybody to really learn how to bring out their best and how they want to play it. And that really, there as a chamber music coach who knows the piece well, not as the great dictator of the notes. Because, part of that, I think, is because I started as a performer's mentality, but also I've been very lucky to have a lot of music published, like from early in my career. And what takes getting used to is once you put it out there, it's out there.
Right.
And people are going to play it however they want to. So there are CD recordings and YouTubes of pieces of mine that are like at half the tempo or just terribly boring, but, good.
Yeah.
I mean, good in a funny way that means that the music is out there being used.
Okay.
And as you can guess, of course I care about how it sounds, but there's a utilitarian meaning that I want to write music that people want to play. And it can't always be excellent. I mean, what does excellent mean? It can't always be played perfectly in tune or exactly the way I want. I want everybody to play it.
Right.
And there are so many different ways of playing it. And if anyone ever asks me, what's my favorite performance of a certain piece of mine, I clam up.
Yeah.
I mean, truly. There's 20 different YouTubes of Sonata Three Lakes so far that I know of.
Yeah.
And I don't have a favorite.
Right. Yeah.
There are some that are closer to the intent, but there's still, more than a handful that really are right on demos. And they're all different from, where this is played a certain way. And that's great.
Yeah. I'm sure you could even say, oh, well, in players A measures 1 through 20, I really like that. But in player B, I really liked how they brought out the development, something like that, where you can pick little parts, But like you said, no two performances are going to be alike because you have two different performers.
Yeah, well, I'll tell you one thing I like about YouTube, which, it's a strength and a weakness, or it's a good and a bad. Because there are some performances that I just don't want anyone to hear because they might judge a piece based on a very non-representative interpretation of a piece. And, and I'm going to be hearing other people's music, not realizing that I'm not hearing it demonstrated the way that it should have sounded also. That's what crowdsourcing is. But in the decade before that, I was always putting up sample recordings of works or parts of works on my website. And really, I can only do that way. So, okay, who's recording this piece am I going to put up?
I see.
And who's going to say, well, why didn't you put up my recording?
Right.
But also, how do I even decide not like that? Because there are so many good ways to play it.
Yeah.
For certain pieces.
Yeah.
Do you swell on this note or do you tongue it differently from the way that, with flute music? A lot of people change the slurs from how I indicated it. And that's great. I indicate them the way that I would play it as a clarinetist. And I've only learned in the last few years that the way that flutists break their phrases with the tongue and with connections is not inherently the same as the clarinet, even though I thought that it was so similar.
Right. Yeah.
So I'm just learning that now at the age of 62.
Well, you're always learning, right? You never stop. Yeah.
I sure hope so.
Oh, shoot. So that kind of segues very beautifully into another question that I thought of before I called you, and that is, when you're composing and you have a motive or a melody in your head, like you said, you're going and you're grocery shopping and then you quick want to jot it down so you don't forget it. When the final product comes out, is it what you had intended? Like, is it how you heard it in your head to begin with? Is it like when it's actually out in final version performance? Does that make sense?
It depends what question you're asking, because what I spontaneously got a spark of might get revised a million times before I finish the piece. But by the time I finish a piece and give it to players, if if you're asking, does it then sound like what I had in mind?
Yeah.
It didn't when I was 17.
Okay.
It almost always does completely by now.
Okay.
Like the last few orchestra pieces I've written, I didn't have to change not even the slightest dynamic.
Wow.
Because I've just gotten used to what to anticipate and what kinds of changes I used to have to make.
Okay.
Dynamics usually were the tricky thing for balance.
Okay.
But that's a craft that gets used to, just like, you know, if I'm you and anyone who's a serious performer or even a serious hobbyist listening to this knows that after a while you can look at a line of music and know what it sounds like.
True. Yeah.
If it's a song melody and it's something you don't have to hear how the whole orchestra sounds. You recognize, oh, that's the tune from such and such song.
Sure.
And so this is sort of the same thing in reverse, except that it involves how different instruments will combine and balance with each other.
Hmm.
And that can vary too, especially with a big ensemble.
Okay.
Because you listen to a lot of different orchestra recordings of the same piece. If it's a complicated texture piece like Ravel or Stravinsky or something, every recording will sound a little different from the next.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, very true. I guess the reason why I had thought of that question was only because a composition professor at Texas Tech University, he teaches theory and composition. And I remember him saying in one of the lectures how when he's writing for pieces, he has these, and of course his oral training is phenomenal, and he's studied music for 20, 30 years plus and been composing and teaching at the university level forever. So I didn't think it was more of a question of like, he didn't have the skill, but it was more like he made a statement saying how I heard those harmonies and that melody in my head it's never the idea or whatever that he had in his mind is so, I don't even know if the word is magical, but it's so arbitrary maybe, where then when he puts it on pen and paper and it's actually like executed, it's not always quite how he envisioned it. Does that make sense? Or I'm probably just babbling now, but...
Oh, I don't think you're babbling. And
yeah.
Again, it depends on the situation, because sometimes if you have different notes in different instruments, and the balance can change how the chord sounds.
Sure.
Or sometimes someone's playing the wrong note.
Huh.
Or, I remember when I was in high school, this is one of these, this is the true confessions part of your show.
Perfect.
Right? But we learned from our mistakes. When I was in high school, there was one other kid who was writing music, who was very competitive. I was not. But he was very sort of nastily competitive and insecure. But he was a terrific piano player. And so we were sort of in it together because we were learning our way through all this. And he basically was a nice guy. It's just that, that there was that aspect to it. So we were reading through a piece of mine and he kept on playing some chord as minor instead of major. And I thought that he was trying to play games with me and be snide or whatever, or try to defy me. And I got really annoyed with him until I saw that I had forgotten to put in the D sharp.
Oh, no.
So,
yeah,
that can happen too.
There you go. Yeah, very true. You do learn from your mistakes.
And now I'm a professional proofreader for a publisher. So it goes around, it comes around.
Exactly. Oh, that's funny. So for the budding new composer, what advice would you give to him or her?
Yeah, that's another one that I could go on for hours too. So probably no matter what you say to me, I could go on for hours. But for that question, I want to divide it sort of into two kinds of answers.
Okay.
One for somebody who's really a budding new composer starting to, and another, so for people who were starting to write, and especially if we're talking about young and high school students who are thinking about what will be their lifelong career.
Sure.
I have to be really serious about that and just say, do not go into music. Do not go into composing. Huh. And I'll tell you why I say that. It's not as draconian as it sounds. I had a few teachers talk that way to me and to everybody who was in 11th and 12th grade in my school. And there were some kids who took that advice. And the ones who took that advice were wise to take it. Because if they could be talked out of it at that point, they weren't going to go the distance. But they might get through college and have a music education and then realize they need another kind of field.
Right.
And not to mention they wasted all the tuition along with the 4 years and so on. There were a few people, including me, who would not hear that. We were so dedicated. We were so absolutely all about it.
Right.
That it doesn't matter what people said to us. To us, that meant keep your eyes open and figure out how to make it work.
Right.
And don't think that it's going to be like when you see a TV movie about Gershwin. That isn't what real life is like. But a really interesting thing was a freshman in college. A few weeks in, one of the composition teachers said to me, "Do you want to be a composer or do you want to compose?"
Wow.
So I was 18, like I hadn't achieved wisdom.
Yeah.
And I just thought that was the stupidest question I had ever heard because to me it was synonymous. And I thought he was asking me which way I wanted to structure the sentence, because being a composer and wanting to compose to me was the same thing.
Right.
But as I got older and met more other students, I realized what he was asking, because some people are truly infatuated with writing music.
Okay.
And infatuated with like having a bunch of blank paper and filling it up with something new. And that whole process of the process of creating, all this is what really drove us. But sometimes I had classmates who like to call themselves composers or like to call themselves composition majors, but they never seem to write anything. They just sort of like they like the identity of being a composer rather than actually writing.
Okay.
And so that's what he was asking. Fortunately, I didn't get it because I wasn't on the wrong side of the answer.
Right.
And I was sort of naive that anybody, like, I still don't understand it. Like, why would you go around saying that if you're not writing music? So, it's not my business to pass judgment on somebody's personality or self-image, especially at that very difficult age of being at the end of high school. But the advice is, if you're thinking about a career, you have to ask yourself, and this is true for any career,
right,
especially in music, and most especially for composing. Why do you want to do it? And what are you thinking?
Yeah.
And the people who can sort of pass through every mental obstacle of going through that, you've already now made it through several of the filters that you have to go through to have a functional life. Because, the disappointment, picture the iceberg metaphor that everybody knows, like you work all this hard and you have all this self-doubt, and then you're on stage and you're great, and that's all that anybody sees.
Right.
So they don't realize how hard your life is. They only realize how hard their life is.
Yeah.
And that, that you have to train people to understand that the great performers have anxiety and frustration also.
Yeah.
So if we start talking about, okay, so past that gate, and your question about young composers who really are in it to be composers, what advice do I give? Is still to really understand what you love and why you're doing it, because now that leads in a lot of different directions, because some composers may want to go to Hollywood or other types of commercial music. A lot of younger composers now are writing concert music when they can, and also doing like video game
right,
scoring or jingle scoring, and supporting their one side of their music by more lucrative kinds of commercial music on the other side. And some people may learn that's what they want to do. A lot of people told me to go write music on Broadway because I wanted to write tunes. Look at Three Lakes, the first movement, and then that, the big love theme, that's the refrain in there. You might as well have Ethel Merman singing it. It's that kind of big tune.
Yeah.
So, you have to love what you're doing.
Right.
You don't go in to love the success. That's a really nice dessert that you sometimes get.
Right.
But you got to love the process of doing it. And when you love the process, you usually make a better product than when you just are sort of feeling like you have to do it. And, for that reason, I won't take too many commissions too close together.
Okay.
And if somebody needs something like now, I'll usually say, I'm sorry, I can't do that, because I don't want to rush.
Sure.
It's a real love fest when I'm working on a piece. I love what I'm doing.
Yeah.
I don't want to crank it out because I'll get, a certain amount of dollars or whatever, and then have a piece I'm not happy with.
Right.
That's not why I'm doing it for just the real love of creating stuff and hearing it.
Yeah.
And so I want it to be something. And also, as far as overall success, I don't think it matters how many pieces you write in your life.
Right. Yeah.
It matters how many pieces will outlive you.
Mm-hmm.
Because, there's some composers who have hardly, what do you know by Mouquet?
Yeah.
And
La Flute de Pan.
or Chaminade.
Mm-hmm.
They're known not only to flutists for one piece,
yep.
but to the world for one piece, which is too bad because, the talent that went into that. And, those are extreme examples, but, you don't have to write a tremendous amount of pieces. Some people just always want to, but,
mm-hmm.
I don't measure my success in my head by how fast I can write something or how many opus numbers I have. But
right.
I absolutely measure it by, I love seeing people posting on their Facebook wall that they're seeing a piece of mine or that they put up a YouTube. That, to me, that's the success, that people want to play it.
Neat. Now, are you avoiding burnout too? Because you want to be a part and you just said, well, love the process, and it's a love thing. So I would think that if you're trying to spew out an incredible high magnitude of compositions in a short amount of time, I would think that there'd be major burnout with that. And then maybe, maybe it's not a love relationship anymore. And it's more like, oh, I have to do this.
Well, I like savoring the process.
Uh-huh.
So, I also like being done with a piece.
Yeah.
And I love engraving and seeing how it looks after I'm done. That's just a funny quirk of mine that I love seeing it engraved. But I have to love working on it, or else, I didn't go into this to crank out products that are similar to, or even to crank out the word product.
Right.
These are my babies and my sweethearts.
Yeah.
And that I just have so much affection for each of these pieces. And if I don't, then it's not ready to share with the world yet. Because if I don't like it.
Yeah. That's very true.
But also, it's the experience of composing. The experience of hearing the performance is great. But, face it, the amount of time I spend working on a piece is a whole lot more hours than I spend listening to performances of it.
Okay.
For anything, no matter how much, because it takes a lot of time to write it.
Right. Yeah, that's great insight. I really appreciate your comment about being in love with the process. Because I get excited as a performer when I put a new piece on my stand. I love practicing. I really like, just kind of finding the patterns. And because music, in my opinion, and I think most musicians would agree with this, there is this, like you were talking earlier about your compositional process. There's a form and there's a structure. And I love finding out, is it sonata-form, or is it theme and variations, or is it rondo, or whatever the case may be. And then once I have it mapped out, and then having the creative side saying, well, what am I saying? And what is the composer saying? And creating a story or a song or depicting a color or a fragrance, that's fun to do it too. So discovering new works and even rediscovering works that have been on my stand for ages, like Bach's Partita. I'm still learning things about Bach's Partita to this day, and I played it a million times, but I love that piece because I'm always discovering something new about what Bach was writing.
Yeah, so I had a high school teacher, the same one who told people not to go into music, he was the head of all the arts in the high school, and he got all the arts kind of teachers together every other spring, or maybe it was every spring. They put on a festival called Joy of Discovery, which to me back then as a teenager was 4 words. That's just what the spring festival was called. And it was a lot of concerts and poetry and painting exhibitions and just, arts festival in the spring. And those words, Joy of Discovery, was no different from saying, May festival. And little by little, as I got older, I realized that was a really powerful expression because that's what it is. It's joy. And it's about discovering that exactly what you were saying. And, I still have the same voracious appetite as when I was 8 years old and learning things, that I just want to listen to things and learn about them. And I mean, sometimes I'll be bored from it, but if I discover a new composer or a new performer or a new kind of music, I want to really go deep and enjoy it. And that's joy of discovery. And so what you were saying about getting a new piece, especially something that appeals to you, and with some pieces, I just discovered, this is going to sound funny. I just discovered something about one of my own pieces that I didn't realize was there.
Oh, wow.
So we were talking about Sonata Three Lakes before.
Right.
There's one thing I did know about interrelation of themes. And, sometimes people talk about musical DNA, that in the background, a lot of times pieces or themes totally don't see each other from one movement to another in a piece. But once you get used to it, you start to realize, oh, this is that transformed or in disguise.
Right.
Absolutely, in composers like Brahms, but so many others. And so in Sonata Three Lakes, there's a motive that's 4 notes going downward diatonically.
Okay.
Usually like da 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 da. And it's in the verse and in the chorus in different ways. And it doesn't necessarily sound like it's the same thing, even though there's always throughout there 4 notes going down diatonically. In the second movement, much slower, there's 4 notes going down chromatically, especially in that piano solo. And I was aware of that when I wrote it. It sort of was a coincidence at first, but I thought, oh, this is great because it just sort of progresses from one mood to the other. And so the other day I was thinking about that and how come it isn't in the third movement? And I thought, oh my goodness, yes, it is.
Oh, wow.
I had no idea that lurking in a lot of the motives of the third movement is that same thing that, just has notes before. I'll let you figure out where it is.
Yeah, I'm going to have to, I want to open up my score now.
Because I know that you mentioned that you had played it.
Yeah. So. No, it's a beautiful piece. And isn't that great to hear from just a composer's perspective? Like, wait, why isn't it in the third movement? And oh, wait, it is. And that's really fascinating.
Well, so, all right, I just pulled out my copy. If you look at bar 5 and bar 6, it has that same 4-note kind of phrase. And then lots of little things like that. But it sounds so different from the way that the 4 notes are in the other 2 movements that, honest to God, I didn't notice this until a few days ago, and I wrote it in 2011 or something.
Oh, wow. No, see, that's exactly like full circle with what I was saying about Bach's Partita. Like, I've stared at the score a bazillion times, but then, like, when you approach it differently or just, now X amount of years later, you have more experiences and you've learned new musical concepts, you're coming to the piece with more experience, hopefully. But because of those new experiences and those new learned concepts, you're able to say, oh yeah, look, there's that sequence or whatnot. But to hear a composer say that about his own music is really intriguing.
Yeah, well, it was sort of funny. So I have to tell you an interesting story, which is very much about this.
Okay.
And it's so fascinating. And it's one of these things that you don't realize until you realize it. I was doing a pre-concert talk at the Philadelphia Orchestra involving the New World Symphony.
Okay.
And I'm fascinated by Dvorak, especially his American years, because of the relationship between Czech folk music and American folk music.
Sure.
Which is really a lot closer than, people say how influenced he was once he came to New York, but the motives were very similar to what he was writing before he came over. So anyway, I said, if you look at the last movement, ba-da-da-da-da-dum, up and down to the same note, and then ba-da-da-da-dum, down and back up to the same note. And there's this access. There's that one note, and it goes up and back, and then it goes down and back, like you're pulling a rubber in both directions back and forth.
Okay.
But it's always those same notes and the same kind of Dorian mode. So then a few years later, I think it was, he wrote the cello concerto.
Okay.
And ba-da-da-dum, ba-da-da-dum. It's exactly the same notes, different rhythm.
Yeah.
And one of the Philadelphia Orchestra cellists was sitting in the audience for this pre-concert talk, and he started crying. And he said, I have played this piece for 40 years. Like, he knows the cello concerto memorized, performing it.
Right.
And how many times has someone like that played the New World Symphony, never realizing it was pretty much the same motive?
Right.
Because it doesn't sound the same. I don't think anyone in the audience knew that. I didn't know it until I started noodling around preparing that pre-concert talk. Because I was going to try to talk about folk music, and then I realized, listen to that.
Yeah, it's very similar to like an experience I had when working on my last DMA recital. I was preparing the Martin News flute sonata, and I thought, wait a second, am I playing the flute sonata or his trio? And sure enough, his flute, cello, piano trio and his flute sonata were written a year apart. And I swear to goodness, the flute sonata and the flute, cello, piano trio are almost identical. And it literally, it just baffled me. And I thought, wait a second, what piece am I actually playing right now? And I had to remind myself that it was the sonata and not the trio. Because there's so many similarities that I looked it up and thought, okay, was this 10 years apart? How far apart did he write these two pieces? And it was 1 year apart from each other. And so, yeah, and again, too, a lot of that might be just also that's the composer's voice. I know I'm being very broad with that, but...
Well, the thing with transformation, and, Brahms, when I was in graduate school at Penn, it was like everything was a cult about Brahms. And which you wouldn't think, because there I am with Richard Wernick and George Crumb and George Rochberg, and bringing in other composers, and everybody was about 20th century, you would think.
Right.
But they were so in love with the 19th century repertoire, and then just learn what you can about music, and then do it in your own language. But with Brahms, and all the musicology staff too, the whole school was like, I learned this, and it's just so true. It stayed with me ever since, that in so many of his pieces, the B theme is pretty much the A theme, maybe upside down, maybe backwards, but it is so organically related, but you don't hear it that way. You would never say, oh, he's using the same theme for the A theme and the B theme.
Okay.
Because it's disguised, but that makes it germane.
Okay.
Because, if you talk about pop music, and in the old days of pop music, and probably always and still, with songs that have a lot of A form,
right?
That B section, which a lot of songwriters used to call it the middle eight, because there was 8 bars in the middle of, it was just the contrast section.
Right.
You write your main thing, and then you pop in the middle. Well, you can tell if they had to stick something in because they had a recording date, they didn't have the middle section yet. Because sometimes it just doesn't belong there. It seems so popped in almost arbitrarily, but sometimes it's so much an outgrowth of the A theme that you don't even know when it turns into something else.
Oh, true. Yeah.
And that's more of a classical music kind of thing.
Oh, I see. Yeah. Oh my goodness, we have covered so much ground and I love it. I could talk to you for hours. It's so much fun for me as, scheduling these interviews and picking, people's brains. And it's like, I told my husband after the last interview, it feels like I just read a whole book, in just that hour time. And I think it's so great that you're being so candid and open about just your experiences and your insights, because I think, time is precious and time is this beautiful resource that we have, and just sharing your experiences and what you've done with your time can really help young, not just performers or composers or musicians, but I think all the different mediums out there are so interwoven and connected, and just the human experience, and so anyways, yeah, I love picking your brain and hearing your background and what you've learned, because we learn a lot through that. But in the last segment of the show, called Picks, do you have any picks for the listeners this week?
Well, I looked through your website to see what kind of stuff goes on with your picks. And I recently you've been talking about essential oils and in general ways of, outside of music, our lives, our bodies. That you were talking about things that are body maintenance that not everybody necessarily knows about.
Right.
And, sharing cool ideas. So I thought I would do that because I learned something a few years ago that was useful. So we all have different ways that we treat sore muscles or strained muscles, whether it's lower back pain or posture problems. And related to music performance or anything else. And gosh, I think flute players are among the most challenged because of the asymmetry.
Yeah.
But also just everyone going through life is carrying around their own body or picking things up, depending where you live, shoveling snow.
Yep.
I was shoveling frozen slush the other day, and, that's really heavy. So,
yeah.
We all know there's different kinds of medicines and physical therapies in the Western sense and in the Eastern sense, and hot and cold and blah, blah, blah. But a few years ago, a flute player told me about arnica cream. That's spelled Arnica. And arnica cream is an inexpensive over-the-counter tube that is made from what's called the arnica plant. And it comes in a tube that looks just like toothpaste. And one of my advices is don't keep it next to your toothpaste because it doesn't taste as good. Not like that ever happened to me, but if it did. All right. So at any rate, what I found and what I'm finding more and more of my friends have already learned about it is that it's remarkably fast and effective in reducing discomfort or whatever. It doesn't have any smell, so that it doesn't distract other people. If you walk into orchestra, it's not like you're wearing Bengay or a camphor and whatever. It doesn't burn or chill your skin. It's just really pleasant and it works well. So some people keep one of these tubes in their gig bag, and it also comes in little pills, that the kind you put under your tongue. It seems like it's only made by one company called Boiron. That's spelled B like boy, Oiron. But if you just Google Arnica, Arnica, you'll find it. And it's like $5 for a tube that will last forever.
Yeah, I just pulled it up and it was easy to find. Yeah, by Boiron. Oh, neat. Well, if it's from a plant, I would think that it would be anti-inflammatory. Because a lot of, and this is something I've been talking, especially with Series 1 in maintenance and preventative care, because I learned the hard way. Like, I had an injury and I had to backtrack and go back to, feeling pain-free. And it could have been easily prevented through preventative measures, just taking care of my body. And so anyways, throughout my research and everything, I found that a lot of disease comes from disease, and it's based on inflammation in the body. And so from the research I've gathered, from my understanding, it's these plants and the different parts of the plants, like the flower, the stem, or the root, and just the food we eat has a major impact in the holistic sense of the entire body. The whole body is a working machine, and if one area is affected, then it's going to affect other areas and it's going to trickle. So, but anyways, long story short, what I'm trying to say is if this is from a plant, I would think that it would be anti-inflammatory, which would reduce the pain and reduce disease in the body. Yeah. Thank you for that suggestion. I had not heard of that before.
You can find it in, like, the white cream, that version of it you can find probably in any big farm, like a CVS or Walgreens kind of store.
Okay.
The pellets might be a little harder to find, but any place that has, more subtle, specific kind of medication and whatever might have it.
Perfect. I really appreciate that suggestion. And my two picks are going to be less noble, but I'm going to pick a movie and a book.
Okay.
I'll start with the movie. I just recently saw the movie titled Leave No Trace, and it's about a father and his daughter surviving out in the wilderness, and it's basically by choice because he has PTSD. So I won't spoil the ending, but it was a great movie, and it did not end the way I had expected, and I really liked the characters. And my book suggestion is Drive by Daniel Pink, and he talks about getting or inspiring, whether it's students or coworkers or your employees, how to get them inspired to work at their fullest potential. And cash is not the way where most of us think, oh, if I give them an incentive like a higher raise or they get a commission, that's actually not how people are inspired to work at their fullest potential. So I thought that was really interesting. Yeah. Well, thank you so much, Daniel, for your time. I don't want to take up any more of it. You've been so great in giving us your insights and your experiences, and I really appreciate your energy and your talents.
Well, thank you for providing the world with Flute 360.
Oh, I really appreciate
and
that.
this interview. And, one thing you probably find is that on one hand, I understand you're thanking me for being generous with my time, but if there's one thing that composers love to do, it's talk about themselves.
Sure.
Especially when people are listening.
Yeah. Today's episode is sponsored by J&K Productions. They produce all of my episodes, from adding the intro and outro music to editing the audio and all post-production needs. Contact them for your next podcast project at jkproductions.media. Thank you for listening to the Flute 360 podcast. For more information, please visit HeidiKBegay.com. And if you enjoyed today's episode, please rate and review in the iTunes store. Let's talk about flute.